There's something to be said about stepping outside the US and finding a place where the baggage of its racial history doesn't follow you around like an unwanted shadow. That's one of the first things African American expats tend to feel when they land in Panama. It's not a utopia, but it's different enough that you notice. But let's not kid ourselves. Panama has its own set of challenges, especially when you look through the lens of race. To really understand what living there means for African Americans, we need to unpack the layers of its diversity and the echoes of a history that shaped both the country and its people. Panama's cultural landscape is diverse in the way a quilt is, stitched together by waves of migration and colonization, each piece carrying its own history. Afro-Panamanians make up a significant slice of this patchwork, with their roots dug deep into the country's soil, brought over generations ago to work on the canal. But the Afro-Panamanian story doesn't begin there. It traces back to the 16th century when enslaved Africans were first brought to Panama by the Spanish, many of whom escaped to form maroon communities, cimarroneras, that resisted colonial rule. Their legacy continues today, seen in places like Colón, a modern hub of Black Panamanian culture. The country's Afro-Caribbean and Afro-colonial heritage are felt everywhere, from the rhythms of calypso and reggae to the food on your plate. For African Americans, landing in Panama can feel like entering a space where race isn't quite as heavy a burden. At least, not in the same way it is in the US. There's no immediate sense of racial danger. No cops watching you too closely, no Karen at the park questioning your right to be where you are. It's a different energy. It's the absence of that particular American racial tension that can make Panama feel like a breath of fresh air. But then again, it's not all rainbows either. Panama doesn't have the kind of loud, in-your-face racism that grabs headlines in the US, but there's still a certain kind of classism and racial hierarchy at play. As a Black expat, you might find yourself mistaken for a domestic worker, especially in more affluent areas where darker skin is often associated with manual labor. It's jarring, especially when you're used to navigating a different set of expectations back in the States. Even in spaces where the locals are warm and welcoming, the assumption about who you are based on your skin doesn't just disappear because you've crossed a border. But, and this is important, race in Panama is tied up with class in a way that's different from the US. The racial hierarchies are present, but they're not the same. And that's where it gets tricky. You might not feel the same fear or anxiety that comes with being Black in America, but you'll still encounter a kind of coded prejudice that hits differently. Some expats say it's almost a relief to deal with this subtler version of racial bias, but it doesn't make it any less real. One of the big draws of Panama for African American expats is the chance to break free from the grind. The cost of living, even in places like Panama City, can be a fraction of what you'd spend in cities like New York or Los Angeles. That stretch your dollar factor is real. You can have a life here that feels comfortable without hustling every second just to make rent. Add to that Panama's healthcare system, which, while not perfect, gives you options that won't financially ruin you. It's one of the reasons retirees flock here. The weather, the affordable lifestyle, and the pensionado program, which hooks you up with discounts on everything from healthcare to public transport. But financial freedom isn't the only kind of freedom African Americans find in Panama. There's a mental shift that happens when you step out of the US racial paradigm. It's not that you stop being Black, nothing can erase that, but you start to see yourself outside of the context of being a Black person in America. The systems that keep you boxed in there don't have as much power here. You can reinvent yourself, build something new, away from the suffocating racial expectations you're used to navigating. Of course, it's not all perfect. For one, Spanish is key. If you're not willing to learn the language, you're cutting yourself off from really engaging with the country. English is spoken in expat-heavy areas, but to truly navigate Panama, you need Spanish. And then there's the issue of isolation. Depending on where you settle, you might find yourself in pockets of expats where the local culture feels far away. Or you could be one of the few Black faces in your neighborhood, which can bring its own challenges. Some expats report a sense of invisibility in those spaces, where race isn't discussed, but you feel it lurking beneath the surface. Then, there's the undercurrent of anti-blackness that, while not as overt as in the US, exists in Panama's history and still shapes its society today. The Afro-Caribbean community, especially those descended from canal workers, has historically faced marginalization. And for those with deeper roots, the legacy of slavery and maroon resistance still echoes. While legal reforms have made strides, the lingering effects of that systemic exclusion remain. For African American expats, understanding this history helps in making sense of the subtle barriers that might come up. For African American expats, Panama offers a kind of freedom that's hard to find back home. It's a space where race doesn't dominate every interaction, where the grind isn't as soul-crushing, and where you can carve out a new life without the weight of American racial baggage. But it's not a magic fix. The racial dynamics in Panama are quieter, but they're still there. The key is coming in with eyes wide open, ready to embrace the good while understanding the challenges that come with being Black in a place where class and race dance together in ways you might not expect. Panama's not perfect, but for many African American expats, it offers a chance to breathe, to reset, and maybe even thrive in ways that the US hasn't allowed.